The nights when the devil creeps into people's homes are the kind of nights no one ever forgets. Picture this: you're lying in bed, the city's dead quiet, and out of nowhere, you hear the soft creak of a window sliding open, slicing through the silence. Imagine a pair of eyes out there in the dark, staring right at you, but you can't see them. Picture a man who doesn't come for money or revenge. He comes for the sick thrill of it. This is the story of Richard Ramirez, the man who turned Los Angeles into pure hell, the man they called the Night Stalker. In this story, you're about to face crimes that rip right through the edge of what your mind can handle. You'll hear the voices of victims who, in their final breaths, came face to face with the devil. You'll see how a man can twist into a monster, and you'll understand why Richard Ramirez's name, still, decades later, haunts California's nights like a damn nightmare. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest kid in a Mexican-American family with 5 children. His dad, Julian Ramirez, was a strict, mean man who worked on the railroad. His mom, Mercedes, was quiet, religious, and lived under her husband's thumb. The Ramirez family was dirt poor, and Julian believed the only way to raise kids right was to beat the hell out of them. Little Richard watched his dad beat his mom over and over. But if you think it was just family violence that built the Night Stalker, you're dead wrong. As a kid, Richard got some serious hits to the head. Once when he was 5, a heavy dresser came down on his skull and knocked him clean out. Then again, at 9, he smashed his head on a swing at school. Lights out. Again. Those hits messed with his brain, rewiring something inside him. He started having epileptic seizures. At night, he'd thrash around in his sleep, scream, then wake up not knowing where the hell he was. His teachers could tell something was off. He'd zone out in class, pick fights with other kids, and sometimes just sit there, staring at the wall, like he was seeing something nobody else could. But the real, most twisted influence on Richard came from one person, his cousin, Miguel Ramirez. Everyone called him Mike. Mike was a former Vietnam vet. He'd seen some straight-up hell out there, stuff that would break most people's minds. And he shared all that darkness with 12-year-old Richard. Mike showed him pictures, war crime photos of Vietnamese women he'd tortured and killed himself. He'd tell Richard every little detail: how they begged, how they cried, how they finally died. And the whole time, Mike would grin like it was no big deal. To him, it wasn't horror. It was normal. He'd say to Richard, out there in war, you're God. You decide who lives and who dies. And that feeling, kid, that's the best damn feeling in the world. Richard soaked up every word like gasoline on fire. At home, all he'd ever known was violence and poverty. At school, no one gave a damn about him. But here, with Mike, he felt like he was being let in on some kind of dark power. Mike taught him how to handle a gun, how to move like a ghost, how to use the dark to his advantage, and most of all, how to look into someone's eyes and feed off their fear like it was oxygen. In 1973, something happened that flipped Richard's world upside down for good. One day, he went over to Mike's place just to see him. Mike was in the middle of a screaming match with his wife, Jessie. Richard stood behind the door, listening. Jessie was yelling, "You're crazy! You're sick! I can't take this anymore." Mike, calm as hell, said, "All right, if you can't take it, then you don't have to." Then, bang, one gunshot. Richard pushed the door open. Jessie was on the floor, blood spilling from her head. Mike was standing there with the gun in his hand, just staring at the body. He turned, caught Richard's eyes, and cracked a smile. "She ain't making noise no more, huh?" Richard was 13. That was the first time he saw death up close. Real death. Something inside him didn't just crack. It woke up. After that day, he wasn't the same kid anymore. He'd climb up on the roof at night and just stare at the sky for hours. He started sketching messed up stuff. Demons, blood, death. When his mom saw those drawings, she cried and begged him, "Mijo, you need to come to church. You need to pray." But Richard just stared back and said, "Where was God when Dad was beating you? Where was God when Mike killed his wife? God ain't real, Mom. Only the devil is." At 14, he ran away from home, headed straight to California. He lived on the streets, got hooked on drugs, started stealing to survive. He fell in with a crew of runaway kids, all of them obsessed with heavy metal and black metal. They'd blast bands like AC/DC for hours, letting that noise fill the night. Richard got hooked on one track in particular, Night Prowler. He played it on repeat, like it was written just for him. Night Prowler, steal the life away. Night Prowler, driving in the dark. Those lyrics carved themselves deep into his head. He started to believe it wasn't just a song, it was a prophecy, his destiny. At 16, he pulled his first real job, broke into a house at night, grabbed some cash and jewelry. But on his way out, he saw her, a woman, sleeping in the bedroom. He crept closer, just staring at her. Her eyes shot open. She saw him. She started to scream, but Richard slapped his hand over her mouth and hissed, "Shh! You scream, you die." The terror in her eyes hit him like a drug. In that moment, Richard felt something new. Power. Like he was God. He didn't hurt her that night. He walked out, but that feeling stayed. That rush, that control. And from then on, he couldn't live without it. In the years that followed, Richard turned into a full-blown coke addict. He snorted the stuff like it was oxygen. His teeth rotted black. His body got skinny as hell, but his head was filled with the darkest fantasies you can imagine. At night, he'd wander the streets of Los Angeles, eyes scanning windows. He'd watch families switch off their lights, tucking into their beds, thinking they were safe. And he'd smile to himself and think, "You think you're safe, but you ain't. I can walk into your house whenever the hell I want, and I can do whatever I damn well please." He started planning. Bought himself shoes that made no sound. Learned how to pick locks clean. Learned how to slide through a house in the dark like a shadow. And then he waited. Waited for that night when the devil whispered in his ear, "Go, it's time." By spring of 1984, Richard Ramirez had turned 24. He wasn't that broken little boy anymore. He was a man now. A man with dark, hollow eyes, blackened teeth, and a soul made of pure night. He lived in a tiny apartment in downtown LA. Neighbors said he was weird. He'd leave at night, come back in the morning, never said a word, just a nod. No one knew where he went. No one knew he was preparing for a hunt history would never, ever forget. Around this time, Richard dove deep into Satanism. He read up on Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan. He fell in love with the idea that man is his own God, that you can do whatever the hell you want, no fear of divine punishment. He got a pentagram tattooed on his body. To his buddies, he'd say, "The devil's the only real thing. He's the boss. I'm his servant." Some thought he was just playing around, being edgy, but the ones who really looked into his eyes, they knew he wasn't joking. He believed it. Every damn word. He'd spend hours in the public library reading about serial killers. Ted Bundy, John Gacy, all of them. He studied how they got caught and made a promise to himself he wouldn't make the same mistakes. No patterns, no fixed type of victim, no favorite weapon. Whatever he found, he'd use. And most importantly, no talking to the victims. Talking means connection, and connection means getting caught. June 28th, 1984, the hottest night of the summer. The air was thick and heavy. Windows all over the city were cracked open just to let some kind of breeze in. Richard Ramirez moved through the darkness like a shadow. He headed for Glassell Park, a neighborhood full of old houses and older folks. Hunting. That's when he saw it. A single-story house with the window wide open. Silent as smoke, he slipped inside. The house was dark, smelled like dust and old perfume. He knew an old woman lived there alone. He crept into the bedroom. She was lying on the bed, breathing slow. Richard reached out his hand, and then her eyes opened. Richard Ramirez, a 79-year-old named Jenny Vinco, opened her eyes to see a dark shadow looming over her. She tried to scream, but before a sound could escape her throat, a hand clamped over her mouth. A big hand with long, bony fingers. The smell of sweat and cigarettes hit her. A voice whispered in the darkness, "Shh, Grandma. If you make a sound, it's gonna get a lot worse." Jenny struggled to breathe with all her might. Her heart was pounding so hard, she thought it would burst out of her chest. She tried to push the man's hand away, but he was far stronger. With his other hand, Richard pulled something out of his pocket. A big kitchen knife he'd stolen from a previous home. He pressed a sharp edge to Jenny's neck and said, "Now I want to take my hand off. But you don't make a sound. Got it?" Jenny, tears streaming down her face, nodded. Richard removed his hand. With a trembling voice, Jenny asked, "What do you want? Money? Jewelry? I'll give you whatever I have. Just don't hurt me." Richard smiled, though the darkness hid it. "I don't want your money. I want something else." His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something in it that chilled Jenny to her core. She knew this man hadn't come just to rob her. He had come for something much worse. Richard ordered Jenny to get up from the bed. He led her into the living room and tied her to a chair with ropes he'd found in the kitchen, binding her hands and feet tightly. Jenny shivered, praying under her breath, "God help me! God save me!" When Richard heard this, he laughed. His laughter echoed through the empty house. "God's not here, Grandma. It's just you and me and the devil. He's always here." Richard then started prowling through the house. He opened drawers, tossed things around, searching for valuables. But he wasn't in a rush. He knew he had time. He knew this house was off the main street, so the chances of anyone hearing him were slim. He found a bottle of whiskey and took a swig. The sweet, bitter taste of alcohol spread in his mouth. He felt alive. He felt powerful. He turned back to Jenny. She was still praying, tears streaming down her face. Richard knelt in front of her, bringing his face close to hers, and said, "You know what I want? I want to see what it feels like when someone dies. I want to see the moment their soul leaves their body." In that moment, Jenny Vinco realized there was no hope left. She knew this man was going to kill her. She stopped praying. She just looked into Richard's eyes and said, "You'll burn in hell. You'll suffer forever." Richard kept his smile, replying, "I'm already in my hell, Grandma, and I'm enjoying it." Then he lifted the knife. What happened in that room is a detail too grim to fully recount. But it's enough to know that when Richard Ramirez left that house, Jenny Vinco was no longer alive. She had become the first official Night Stalker victim. That night, Richard left the house with bloodied hands. He felt reborn. He felt like no limits existed for him anymore. He went back to his apartment, changed clothes, and slept for a few hours. When he woke up in the morning, the news of Jenny Vinco's murder was on TV. Reporters called it a brutal killing. The police had no leads. Richard looked at the screen and smiled. He thought, "This is just the beginning." But Richard made a mistake. He thought he could do it all over again and never get caught. He thought the police would never find him. What he didn't know was that he'd made a tiny slip-up. He'd left a fingerprint on a window at the crime scene. The police found it and logged it into the database. At that time, Richard didn't have a serious criminal record, so his print wasn't in the system. He'd gotten lucky, but luck doesn't last forever. Weeks passed. Richard waited. He wanted to feel that rush again. But this time, he decided to do things a bit differently. He didn't just want to target elderly women. He wanted variety. He wanted to see how fear looked on different faces. On the night of March 27th, 1985, he went to the Reseda neighborhood. It was a nice, safe area where young families lived. Richard picked a 2-story house with a neat little garden. He circled the house and found an unlocked window. He slipped inside silently. Inside the house, a young couple was asleep. Vincent and Maxine Zazara. Vincent, 44, worked for a transportation company. Maxine, 34, was a successful lawyer and mother to a 6-year-old daughter who was spending the night at her grandmother's. Richard didn't know this. All he knew was there were 2 people inside, and he wanted to see them. He went upstairs. The stairs creaked under his weight, but not enough to wake anyone. Vincent and Maxine lay asleep together. Maxine woke up with the sound of the strike. She opened her eyes and saw a man standing over her husband, hammer in hand. She screamed, a scream that should have woken the whole neighborhood. But Richard moved fast. He leaped onto the bed and grabbed Maxine's hand. His voice, trembling with rage and excitement, barked, "Tie her up, now. Tie her up, or I'll kill both of you." Maxine looked at Vincent, lying on the bed, motionless, blood everywhere. She looked at Richard, her voice breaking. Please don't kill him. I'll do anything you say. Just don't kill him." Richard stared at her face. Maxine's tears ran down her cheeks. Her eyes were red and swollen. Richard felt that power again, that feeling of having a human life in his hands. He said, "All right, darling Maxine, if you want to stay alive, you have to do exactly as I say. Got it?" Maxine nodded. Richard forced her down from the bed. He bound her hands with an electrical cable he had ripped from the wall. Then he led her to the next room and closed the door. He returned to Vincent. The man was still alive, but his breathing was weak. Richard sat by the bed, staring at him. "You know why I'm here? Because I can. Because no one can stop me. Because I am God," he said. Vincent tried to speak but couldn't. Blood spilled from his mouth. Richard lifted the hammer again and struck. This time, it was over. He then returned to the room where Maxine was. She was sitting on the floor, crying. Richard opened the door and stepped in. Maxine looked at him, pleading, "Vincent, where's Vincent? What did you do?" Richard didn't answer. He just smiled, the same evil smile that would make anyone's soul shiver. Maxine understood. She realized her husband was gone. She started screaming. Richard approached her and put his hand over her mouth. Shh! Now it's quiet time. Time to pray, he said. Maxine tried to escape his grip, but Richard was stronger. He did what no human with a conscience could do. And when it was over, he left the room, rifled through the house, took jewelry and cash, and then walked out as if nothing had happened. The next morning, neighbors noticed the Cesara house's door was open. One of them went inside and saw a horrifying scene they would never forget. The police were called immediately. Detectives began examining the crime scene. They realized this wasn't the work of a typical thief. This was someone who took pleasure in violence. Someone who didn't just want money, but wanted life itself. Detective Frank Salerno, who had spent years in the homicide division, looked at the scene and told his partner, "This is the work of a psychopath who's just getting started. If we don't catch him fast, he'll go after more victims." He wasn't wrong. 2 weeks later, on March 27 again, Richard struck once more, this time in Monterey Park. His victims were Sumi and Lillian Dewey, an elderly couple who had been together for over 40 years. Richard slipped in through the kitchen window. Richard had a .22 caliber Colt pistol he'd stolen from a previous victim. He aimed the gun at Sumi and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out. Lillian raised her hands and pleaded, "No, please. We're old. We don't have much. Just don't kill us." Richard approached her. He caught the floral scent of her perfume. He looked into her terrified eyes and said, "I didn't come to take anything from you. I came to see you. I came to experience." Lillian didn't understand what he meant. All she knew was this man was insane. She tried to run toward the door, but Richard was faster. He grabbed her and threw her to the ground. Her head hit the corner of a table, and blood streamed from her forehead. Richard straddled her and wrapped his hands around her neck. He began to squeeze. Lillian struggled, flailing her arms and legs, trying to breathe, but couldn't. Her eyes were bulging, her face turning purple. And then it was over. Richard got up off the bodies. He was panting. Sweat dripped from his forehead. He looked at Lillian's body and then at Sumi's. 2 people in one night. He felt his power growing. He felt unstoppable. He roamed the house, grabbing valuables, and then did something that would horrify the police. Using Lillian's blood, he drew a pentagram on the bedroom wall, a symbol of the devil. He wanted to send a message. He wanted to say, "I was here, and I'll be back." The next morning, when the police entered the Dewey house, Detective Salerno saw the pentagram and realized the situation was worse than he thought. He told his colleagues, "This guy left a message. He wants us to know he's going to continue. He's starting a war." And he was right. Because Richard Ramirez had just begun. He had tasted blood, and he couldn't stop anymore. On March 30th, he went to the Burbank neighborhood and attacked 22-year-old Melody. Melody lived alone in her apartment. Richard slipped in through a window and caught her asleep. He held his gun to her head and said, "If you make a sound, I'll kill you." Melody looked at him in terror and said, "I'll do whatever you say. Just don't hurt me." Richard smiled and said, "Good girl. Now get up." He took Melody to the living room and tied her to a chair. He tortured her for hours. He told her how powerful he was, how he could take her life at any moment. Melody cried and begged, but Richard just laughed. He told her, "You belong to the devil now, and I am the devil's servant." But that night, something strange happened. Richard decided not to kill Melody. He didn't know why. Maybe she reminded him of his little sister. Maybe he was tired. Or maybe even a monster has moments of weakness. He let Melody go and said, "You're lucky, but remember, I can come back anytime I want." Then he climbed out the window and vanished into the darkness. Melody stayed on the chair until morning, unable to move, crying and praying that he wouldn't return. On May 10, 1985, Richard Ramirez returned to the Monterey Park neighborhood. This time, his targets were a 64-year-old couple, William and Lillian Dewey. He entered through the same window he had used before. William was asleep on the couch. Richard crept up silently and pressed his gun to William's head. The gunshot echoed through the quiet night like thunder. Lillian, who was in the bedroom, woke up to the sound. She stepped out and saw Richard. She tried to scream, but Richard acted faster. He ran toward her and grabbed her. Lillian struggled, but Richard threw her to the ground and punched her in the face. Once, twice, 3 times, until she could resist no longer. That night, Richard carried out his acts with even more terror. He dragged Lillian into the bedroom and tortured her. He wanted her to beg him. He wanted to see how much a human could endure. Lillian whispered weakly, "Please, I'm old. I can't take anymore." But Richard didn't listen. He just laughed and said, "Endure it, Grandma. This is just the beginning." When he was done, he wrote on the wall with Lillian's blood, "Jack the Ripper has returned." He wanted the police to be afraid. He wanted everyone to be afraid. Richard whispered in Jean's ear, "Shh, Grandma. You don't want the neighbors to come and see what happened to your husband, do you?" Jean's whole body trembled. She tried to escape, but she couldn't. Richard dragged her to the bedroom. He threw her on the bed and tied her hands with the lamp's electrical cord. Jean cried and begged, "Why? Why are you doing this? What did we ever do to you?" Richard sat beside the bed with an eerie calm and said, "You did nothing wrong, but this world is a jungle, and I'm the predator. You're just prey." Jean couldn't comprehend. She couldn't believe a human could be this ruthless. Richard spent hours in the Wu house that night. He quietly searched the home. "When the sun rises, I'll still be alive. I'm free. But you and your husband, you'll never see the sun again." And then he finished his work. On May 29, in Beverly Hills, Richard chose a bigger target. A large mansion with a vast garden and tall fences. He thought a house like this must hold a lot of money. He climbed the wall and entered the garden. The house was dark. Everyone was asleep. He broke the kitchen window to get inside. The sound of breaking glass in the quiet night was like an explosion. Yet, no one woke. Richard smiled. He thought, "These people are so foolish. They don't even know what they're losing." He went upstairs. There were 2 bedrooms. In the first room, a young couple was asleep. Christopher and Virginia Patterson, both 32. Christopher was a lawyer. Virginia, a teacher. They were just married and inherited the house from Virginia's father. Richard entered the room, drew his gun, and approached the bed. He pressed the gun to Christopher's head and pulled the trigger. The gunshot woke Virginia. She opened her eyes and saw Christopher lying beside her. She began screaming. Richard pointed the gun at her and said, "Shut up or I'll kill you." Virginia raised her hands to her face, trembling. "No, God, no." Richard stepped closer. "God isn't here. I said God isn't here." He pulled Virginia off the bed, took her to the bathroom, and with the gun at her head said, "Now tell me where your jewelry is. Tell me where your money is. And if you lie, I'll finish you right here." Virginia's voice shook. "You, in the closet, bedroom, a box. It's there." Richard smiled. "Good girl. Sit here and don't move." He returned to the bedroom, found the jewelry box filled with rings, necklaces, and gold bracelets, and stuffed them into his pockets. He then went to the second room, where the Pattersons' young daughter, 6-year-old Emily, was sleeping with her doll. She was innocent and peaceful. Richard paused. Something inside him said, "No, not this one." He closed the door and turned back. This was one of the few moments he observed a limit. He never harmed children, not out of kindness, but because even he had lines he refused to cross. He went back to the bathroom. Virginia was still there, crying. Richard looked at her. "You're lucky. Tonight is a good night for me. You'll live." The next morning, when the police arrived at the Pattersons' house, Virginia was still in the bathroom. She couldn't speak, only cried, staring at her husband's body in the bedroom. Detective Salerno, hearing Richard's message, realized they had no time to waste. This killer was growing bolder. He no longer feared the police. He was sending them a message. He had power, and no one could stop him. Salerno told his chief, "We need all our forces on this case. This guy is about to turn the entire city into hell." On June 27th, in Arcadia, Peter and Barbara Pan, a 66-year-old couple, were his targets. Richard entered through the living room window. Peter was asleep in the bedroom. Barbara was drinking water in the kitchen. Richard silently approached and wrapped his hand around her throat. Barbara tried to scream, but couldn't. Richard dragged her to the bedroom. Peter woke up, tried to get out of bed, but Richard was faster. He struck Peter on the head with a hammer, knocking him unconscious. Barbara screamed. Richard looked at her. "You want to live?" Barbara nodded. "Good, then do exactly as I say." He forced Barbara to lead him to where money and jewelry were hidden. She took him to the basement, where a small safe was located. "Open it," Richard said. Barbara entered the combination with trembling hands. Inside, cash and jewelry were stacked. Richard smiled. "Good, Grandma. Now I don't need you anymore," Barbara begged. "Please, I did what you said. Please don't kill me." But Richard didn't listen. He raised the hammer. Barbara closed her eyes and whispered her last prayer. On July 2nd, in Monrovia, Mary Louise Cannon, 83, lived alone. Richard entered through the back door. Mary Louise was asleep in her armchair. Richard approached her. He looked at her white hair, wrinkled face, trembling hands. He thought, "This woman doesn't have long. Why should I bother?" But then a voice in his head said, "Because you can. Because she's weak. Because she's easy." And Richard obeyed the voice. He grabbed Mary Louise's hand and woke her. The elderly woman opened her eyes and saw Richard. She didn't flinch. She just looked tired. "You came to kill me?" she asked. Richard was surprised. He expected screaming and begging, not this strange calm. "Yes," he said. Mary Louise nodded. "Then do it. I'm ready. My husband died last year. My children are far away. I'm ready." Richard, for the first time in his life, felt confused. He didn't know what to do. He just stood and stared at Mary Louise. After a few moments of silence, Richard said, "Aren't you afraid?" Mary Louise gave a faint smile. "Son, I'm 83. I've seen war. I've seen poverty. I've watched loved ones die. You think I fear you? You're just a lost boy." Something inside Richard broke. For a moment, he became that 13-year-old boy who had witnessed his cousin's murder. He became that child, beaten by his father. He lowered his hand. I have to go," he said, and left the house without harming Mary Louise. But this moment of weakness didn't last. The next night, Richard went back to hunting. On July 7th, in the San Gabriel neighborhood, Joyce Lawson Nelson, 61, became his victim. Richard entered through the window and killed her in her sleep. Swiftly, ruthlessly. No words, no hesitation. He had become that killing machine again. July 20th, 1985, and the blazing summer heat had gripped Los Angeles like a vice. People left their windows open at night to let in some air. But that's exactly what Richard Ramirez wanted. Open windows meant easy access. It meant easy prey. That night, he made his way to Glendale. He picked a house with its lights off and a window wide open. Like always, he slipped inside silently. The house was dark, quiet. He headed upstairs. In the bedroom, Max and Lily Noller were asleep. Max was 66, Lily 64. Both retired, living a simple, peaceful life. They thought they were safe in their quiet neighborhood. But tonight, safety was just an illusion. Richard crept toward the bed. He had the hammer he'd taken from the last house in his hand. He lifted it and brought it down on Max's head. A solid, brutal strike. Max jolted awake, but it was too late. Blood poured from his head, and he collapsed onto the pillow. Lily woke to the thud. She tried to scream, but Richard was faster, clamping his hand over her mouth. In a calm but threatening voice, he said, "You make a sound, and I'll finish you, just like your husband. Got it?" Lily shook her head, eyes wide with terror. Richard withdrew his hand. With a trembling voice, Lily asked, "Max, how's Max?" Richard looked at Max's body and said, "Your husband's not coming back, but you can still live if you do exactly what I say." Lily stared at him. She could see Max didn't move. She saw the blood streaming across the pillow. She knew he was gone. And now she was alone with this monster. Richard pulled Lily off the bed and led her to the living room. He sat her down on the couch and said, "Now tell me, where'd you stash your money and jewelry?" Tears running, she pleaded, We don't have much. We're just retired." Richard raised the hammer, bringing it close to her head. "Don't lie. Everyone's got something. Now spill, or I'll kill you." With a broken voice, Lily whispered, "In the bedroom, second drawer of the dresser. There's a small box." Richard smiled. "Good girl. Now sit here and don't move." He went back to the bedroom, grabbed the box, and inside were a few rings, a pearl necklace, and some cash. He pocketed it all. Returning to the living room, Lily still sat there, crying. Richard looked at her. He could see this. He stepped closer. "Do you know why I'm here?" He wanted to see how far he could push a human to the edge of insanity. Lily couldn't even cry anymore. She just prayed it would end. And finally, when Richard grew tired, he finished his work. He killed Lily and left the house, just like always. The next morning, the Noller's daughter, worried because she hadn't been able to reach her parents, came to the house. What she saw inside changed her forever. She never forgot that scene. For years, she had night terrors, and she wasn't alone. All of Los Angeles was living in fear. People no longer slept at night. They added extra locks to their doors. They bolted windows tight. But everyone knew that if the Night Stalker wanted in, no lock or chain could stop him. August 6th, Northridge. Christopher and Virginia Peters. He slipped in through the kitchen window. Quietly, he crept upstairs, entered the bedroom. Christopher and Virginia were asleep, hand in hand. Richard pulled out his gun. He approached the bed, aimed at Christopher's head. He was about to pull the trigger, but at that moment, Christopher's eyes snapped open. He saw Richard. He tried to get up, but Richard was faster. The shot rang out in the room. Christopher collapsed onto the bed. Virginia woke to the sound. She saw her husband. She screamed. Richard pointed the gun at her. "Bring it! Now, bring it!" Virginia raised her hands. "Please, please don't kill me. I'm pregnant." Richard paused for a moment. He looked at her belly. He saw the slight ump. He knew she wasn't lying. He had his rules, after all. He didn't harm children or pregnant women. It was one of the few codes he stuck to. He looked, but not all of Richard's victims were that lucky. August 8th, Diamond Bar. Ahmed Yusuf, 35, and his wife Sukma, 29. They had immigrated from the Middle East to the US, trying to build a new life. Ahmed worked at a small store, and Sukma stayed home to care for their 2 young children. That night, the kids were at their grandparents' house. Ahmed and Sukma were alone. Richard climbed in through the back window. He heard the TV in the living room. Quietly, he crept over. Ahmed was sitting on the couch, watching the news. Sukma was in the kitchen washing dinner dishes. Richard pulled out his gun and approached Ahmed. He pressed the gun to the back of Ahmed's head. "Don't move." Ahmed jumped up. He tried to turn, but Richard slammed him to the ground with the butt of the gun. Sukma heard the commotion and ran out of the kitchen. Seeing Richard standing over her husband, she started begging in her native language. Richard didn't understand the words, but he got the tone. He aimed the gun at Sukma and said in English, "Shut up. Shut up or I'll kill you." Sukma raised her hands to her face, speaking broken English. "Please, please no kill. We who nothing. We poor people," Richard laughed. "Everyone says that. Everyone says they're poor. But everyone's got something I want." He forced Ahmed to stand and follow him to the bedroom. Sukma followed them. Richard made both of them sit on the floor and tied their hands with rope. Then he began searching the house. He opened drawers, pulled things out, looking for anything valuable. He found some cash, a watch, and a few simple pieces of jewelry. Not much, but enough for Richard. He returned to the bedroom. Ahmed and Sukma were still sitting on the floor. Ahmed looked at Richard and said with his accent, "You got what you wanted. Now go. Please just go." Richard looked at him. He could see that Ahmed was a proud man, someone who tried to stay strong, even in this situation. And that made Richard angry. He didn't want his victims to be strong. He wanted them scared. He wanted them begging. He approached Ahmed and kicked him in the face. Ahmed fell to the ground. Blood poured from his mouth. Sukma screamed. Richard turned to her and said, "Bring the rope." I said, "Bring the rope." Sukma covered her mouth with her hands, trying to stifle her scream. That night, Richard did something even unusual for him. He forced Ahmed to watch as he hurt Sukma. He wanted to torture Ahmed, not just physically, but mentally. He wanted to make him feel powerless. Ahmed struggled, tried to tear the ropes, but he couldn't. All he could do was watch and hear his wife beg. And that was enough for Richard. He took pleasure in seeing Ahmed's pain and suffering. When he was done, he drew a pentagram on Sukma's forehead. He used her lipstick. He wanted the police to know it was him. He wanted them to be scared. Then he looked at Ahmed and said, "Now you know what it feels like when you can't do anything. You know what it feels like to be powerless. This is a lesson you'll never forget." And then he killed both of them and left the house. The next day, when the police entered the house, they saw a scene that even experienced detectives were shocked by. Detective Salerno, seeing the pentagram on Sukma's forehead, realized this killer no longer cared about anything. He wasn't even trying to hide anymore. He wanted everyone to know who he was. He wanted everyone to be scared. Salerno told his team, "This isn't just a normal murder anymore. This is a message. This guy is playing with us, and we need to catch him as fast as possible." August 18th, Northridge neighborhood. Yeah, this time, Richard had left Los Angeles. He headed north. He thought maybe he'd have better luck in another city. He went to the house of Peter and Barbara Pan, a 66-year-old couple living in a quiet neighborhood. Richard climbed in through the kitchen window. He made his way upstairs. Peter and Barbara were asleep. Richard pulled out his gun and walked toward the bed. He pulled the trigger once, twice. Both bullets hit Peter in the head. Barbara woke up to the sound of the shots. She tried to scream, but Richard quickly covered her mouth. He dragged Barbara off the bed and into the bathroom. He sat her in the bathtub and said, "Now, I want you to tell me where you keep your money." Through tears, Barbara said, I have a purse in the closet, bedroom." Richard went and found the purse. Inside were cash and credit cards. He took them all. Then he returned to the bathroom. Barbara was still sitting in the tub, crying. Richard looked at her and said, "You know you're lucky. I'm in a good mood today. You're going to live." Barbara stared at him, unable to believe it. Richard said, "But you tell the police that the Night Stalker came and left. You tell them he's coming back. Got it?" Barbara nodded. Richard left the house. But this time, he made a mistake. He fled with the victim's car, an orange station wagon belonging to Peter Pan. He thought he could use the car to get back to Los Angeles without anyone noticing. But he was wrong. The San Francisco police immediately logged the car's license plate into the system. And now, for the first time, the police had a solid lead. August 24th, Richard returned to Los Angeles. On August 28th, Detective Salerno stood at a press conference, showing Richard Ramirez's photo to the media. He said, "This man is our prime suspect in the Night Stalker case. If you see him, contact the police immediately. He's armed and extremely dangerous." Richard's photo was plastered across TVs, newspapers, and radio stations. All of Los Angeles now knew who the Night Stalker was. Early that morning, Richard woke up and went to a store to buy cigarettes. As soon as he entered, he noticed everyone staring at him. He didn't understand why. He bought his cigarettes and stepped outside. Passing a newsstand, he saw his own face on the covers of newspapers. He froze for a moment. His heart started racing. He realized it was over. He realized he couldn't run anymore. He took off running. He tried to blend into the crowd. He tried to get back to his apartment, to grab his things and escape. But everyone recognized him. People started shouting, "That's the Night Stalker! That's the Night Stalker!" Richard kept running. He reached a Hispanic neighborhood. He thought maybe he could hide there, but he was wrong. People there recognized him too. A man stepped forward and lunged at him. Then another man. Then women. They all started beating him. Richard tried to defend himself, but there were too many. He fell to the ground. They kicked him, punched him, screamed at him. One of the men shouted, "You thought you could come into our homes and kill us. Thought no one would stop you." Richard tried to speak, but his mouth was full of blood. All he could do was breathe. For the first time in his life, he felt true fear. He realized what it felt like to be powerless. "Night Stalker, glad we finally met." Richard looked at him. His face was covered in blood, his black teeth broken, his eyes swollen. But he still had that wicked smile on his lips. He said, "You think you got me? You got nothing. The devil is still here, and he's coming back." Richard Ramirez's arrest. On August 29, 1985, sent Los Angeles, gray walls, a metal table, 2 chairs. Ramirez dropped into one of the chairs, his hands cuffed to the table. He stared at the wall and grinned. Salerno walked in carrying a thick folder, set it down, and sat across from him. For a beat, nobody said a word. Salerno just looked at Ramirez. Ramirez stared at the wall. Finally, Salerno said, "Richard, you know why you're here?" Ramirez turned his head to him, and cool as you like, said, "Yeah, I know. 'Cause you think I'm a killer." Salerno opened the folder and pulled out crime scene photos, gruesome shots of the victims, and laid them in front of Ramirez. Ramirez looked at them and didn't flinch. Salerno asked, "You know these people?" Ramirez smiled and said, "No, I don't know any of these people." Salerno pulled out another photo. The pentagram Ramirez had painted on a wall at one crime scene. "So what about this? You drew this satanic symbol, didn't you?" Ramirez looked at it. For a second, something flashed in his eyes. He said, "That ain't a devil's symbol. It's a symbol of power, a symbol of freedom, a symbol that you can do whatever the hell you want." Salerno shut the folder, leaned back. He knew Ramirez was clever and wasn't gonna confess easy. So, he switched tactics. "Let me tell you something, Richard. We got solid evidence. Your fingerprints, witnesses who saw you, the stolen car you used to run. You know your game's up, so why not make it easy on yourself and talk?" Ramirez shook his head. "I got nothing to say. I want my lawyer. Salerno knew the rules. Once a suspect asks for a lawyer, questioning stops. He stood up. Fine. Richard, you'll see your lawyer. But know this. The game you're playing, it's the one you lose. In the end, you lose. He left the room and shut the door. Ramirez sat alone and stared at the ceiling. He knew Salerno was right. The evidence piled up, but a part of him still clung to hope. Maybe he could run. Maybe a lawyer could save him. Deep down, he knew those were just illusions. The game was over. A few days later, they moved him to LA County Jail, the place they kept the city's most dangerous. He went into solitary, a tiny cell with an iron bed, a toilet, a sink, no window, one dim light that stayed on day and night. He lay on that bed and thought about everything he'd done. The scared faces, the begging voices, and he smiled. No remorse. He wished he could relive those moments. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's team was building the case, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, analyzing fingerprints, DNA, everything that could link Ramirez to the crimes. Every day they found more. Every day the case against him got stronger. A month later, Ramirez made his first court appearance. An arraignment to read the charges. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras, and people who wanted to see the Night Stalker, a 60-year-old woman named Judge Elizabeth Johnson, adjusted her glasses and looked over the charges. "Mr. Ramirez," she said, "you are charged with 14 counts of murder, 5 counts of second-degree murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary with breaking and entering. Do you understand the charges?" Ramirez looked up and answered calmly, "Yes." "And how do you plead?" the judge asked. Ramirez grinned, raised his cuffed hand as far as it would go, and showed the cameras the palm where someone had drawn a pentagram in pen. He shouted, "I belong to the devil." The words echoed through the courtroom. People were stunned. Reporters scribbled. Cameras zoomed. Judge Johnson slammed her gavel. "Mr. Ramirez, your conduct is unacceptable." Ramirez just laughed, like it was all a joke. His attorney, Daniel Hernandez, stood fast. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty." The judge nodded. "Very well. Trial set for 6 months. Mr. Ramirez will remain in custody." She banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. Officers led Ramirez away. As he walked out, he turned, looked at the crowd, and shouted, "The devil lives, and he always will." The phrase hung in the air long after he left. Months inside the jail were bizarre. Ramirez got piles of mail, letters from admirers, women who'd fallen for him, young fans who saw him as a hero. Ramirez replied to some, "I did what I had to do. I was free. If I had the chance again, I'd do it again." Those letters leaked to the press and sparked public outrage. People couldn't wrap their heads around someone idolizing such a monster. One of his correspondents was a 23-year-old named Dorian Levy, who wrote weekly, professing love and understanding. Ramirez sent pictures, poems, promises of marriage if he ever got out. Dorian believed it. She truly thought Ramirez was a misunderstood man, scarred by a rough childhood. On February 15, 1987, Ramirez's full trial kicked off, one of the biggest in California history. Hundreds of journalists flew in. The courtroom was full every day. Some came to gawk, some to mourn the victims, some out of morbid curiosity. Prosecutor Philip Halpin laid out a rock-solid case. Eyewitnesses who'd seen Ramirez at scenes. Forensic evidence tying Ramirez's prints to victims' homes. Shoe prints matching his boots. He had everything needed to convict. The first witness was Barbara Pan, the woman whose husband Ramirez had killed, but who survived. She was brought in by wheelchair. She'd had a heart attack after that night and couldn't walk. Sitting on the stand, she stared at Ramirez. Ramirez stared back and grinned. The courtroom shook. Barbara began to tell her story in a trembling voice. How she'd woken to a man with dark eyes, how he killed her husband, how he tortured her and told her to tell the police. The Night Stalker was back. The courtroom went silent. People wept as she finished. Halpin asked, "Can you identify the man who broke into your home?" Barbara pointed with a shaking hand and said, "Yes, that's him. That's the man who killed my husband." Ramirez looked at her and winked. Barbara closed her eyes and sobbed. Judge Johnson warned Ramirez sternly, "Mr. Ramirez, I will not tolerate this conduct. One more outburst, and you'll be removed." Ramirez shrugged. "As you wish, Your Honor." Detective Salerno testified next, laying out the investigation. How they matched fingerprints, how they tracked him down. "We were dealing with a serial killer with no consistent pattern. He attacked randomly," Salerno said. "That made it hell to catch him. But he made one mistake." Halpin asked, "What was that mistake?" Salerno, "He fled in one victim's car. We lifted prints from that car, matched them to prints from other scenes. And when we ran them through the system, the name came up, Richard Ramirez." Weeks of testimony followed. Survivors told their stories. Forensic pathologists read autopsy reports. Fingerprint experts explained how Ramirez's prints matched those found at crime scenes. With each witness, the case tightened. Defense lawyer Daniel Hernandez tried to mount a defense. Childhood abuse, psychiatric disorders, lack of responsibility. Calling psychiatrists to testify, Ramirez suffered from antisocial personality disorder, lacked empathy, had been under drug influence. The jury didn't buy it. They heard evidence Ramirez acted deliberately, took pleasure in his acts, and showed no remorse. On September 20th, 1989, after 22 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Judge Johnson asked, "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman stood. "Yes, Your Honor." He read the verdict count by count. On the first-degree murder charge in the Jenny Vinco case, we find the defendant guilty. On the first-degree murder charge in the Vincent Zazzara case, guilty. On the first-degree murder charge in the Maxine Zazzara case, guilty. One by one, He read them all, guilty on every count. The courtroom fell silent. Then the sobbing began, one survivor after another. Ramirez showed no reaction. He sat and smiled, as if none of it touched him. Judge Johnson hammered the gavel to restore order. Mr. Ramirez, you have been found guilty on 13 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary with breaking and entering. Your sentence will be pronounced at the next hearing. She banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing convened. Judge Johnson looked at Ramirez and asked if he had anything to say before sentence. Ramirez stood, scanned the room, the victims' families, reporters, and spoke. You all think I'm a monster. You think I'm the worst person on earth. You're wrong. I was someone who had the guts to be free. I did what I wanted. You all live under laws and rules. I was free. If I had the chance again, I'd do it again. I belong to the devil. The devil never dies. The courtroom went utterly quiet. Nobody could believe his lack of remorse, that he still thought he'd done right. Judge Johnson's face flushed. She slammed the bench. Mr. Ramirez, you show not one shred of remorse, not 1 ounce of guilt. For that, I sentence you to death. You are to be executed in the gas chamber for each of the 13 counts of first-degree murder. May God have mercy on your soul, for I will not. Ramirez laughed, looked at the judge. Death has always been beside me. I do not fear death. I await it. Guards led him away. As he left, he shouted at the crowd, "It's not over. You're all gonna die. I'll see you in hell." His voice echoed through the courtroom until he was fully gone. Richard Ramirez got shipped off to San Quentin, the big-time prison up in Northern California that's all about housing death row inmates. This place, one of the oldest, toughest prisons in the States. High walls, armed guards, a vibe that's soaked in hatred and hopelessness. They tossed Richard into the death row wing, where guys waiting for their execution date sit and stew. His cell, tiny, like 2 meters by 3 meters. Just an iron bed, a toilet, and a sink. A little window up high that only gave him a slice of the sky. Nothing else. But even locked up, Richard couldn't chill. He was proud of his rep among the other inmates. He pulled together a small crew of admirers, guys who actually looked up to him because of the stuff he'd done. They called him Night Stalker, and he ate that title up. He'd spin tales of his crimes for them, giving away details that even didn't make it to the courtroom. Watching their shocked, scared faces, he got off on that. Not everyone in there liked Richard, though. "You're just a filthy animal." Guards jumped in quick and pulled them apart. Richard ended up with a broken nose, blood dripping from his mouth, but he was still grinning. He looked at Bill and said, "You think you can break me? You ain't got it in you. I'm unbreakable." Bill spat and shot back. One day you'll die in that chair, and I'll be celebrating. But that day never came. Not anytime soon, anyway. California's justice system is slow, and death row inmates often wait decades for their sentences to be carried out. And in 1996, they got married. Inside the prison, a tiny ceremony with just a few people. Doreen in a white wedding dress, Richard in his orange prison jumpsuit. They promised each other forever. Then they kissed. The whole world was shook. People couldn't believe a woman could marry a serial killer. But Doreen said she loved him. That marriage didn't last. A few years later, Doreen read in a magazine that Richard had been writing another one of his fans, telling her he loved her too. Doreen felt betrayed. She stopped visiting, stopped sending letters, and filed for divorce. Richard heard about it and just laughed. He told a fellow inmate, "Women are all the same. Think they can change you. But I'll never change." Years rolled on. Richard got older. His hair went white. His black teeth all fell out. His body got skinny and frail. But his mind, still just as dark and violent as ever. He still talked about his crimes. Still said he didn't regret a thing. Still claimed if he got the chance, he'd do it all over again. In 2013, Richard got sick. Started coughing, coughs he couldn't control. Went to the prison infirmary, and the doctors checked him out. Found out he had liver cancer. Advanced, nasty stuff. When Richard heard, his first reaction, he laughed. "Well, looks like the devil finally came for me," he said. Doctors told him he had just months to live, and it was too late for treatment. Richard spent his last months in the prison's medical ward, lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his life, everything he'd done, all the people he'd killed. Regret? Nah. Still thought he'd done the right thing. Still thought he'd been free. Still thought he was a servant of the devil. One day, a guard asked him, "Richard, you know you're dying. Got any message for your victims' families? Any apologies?" Richard looked at him. Eyes that once burned with evil and rage now looked tired and dull. In a weak voice, he said, "I got no message. I did what I had to do. If people can't accept it, that's on them, not me." The guard shook his head and walked away. On June 7th, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at age 53 in San Quentin. Not by the state, not in a gas chamber, but from cancer. When the news hit, reactions were all over the place. Some said, "Good, now he can't hurt anyone else." Others said, "He should have been executed, not just die naturally." And some, his crazy fans, cried, saying he was a hero nobody understood. But for the victims' families, Richard's death didn't change a thing. They still felt the pain, still woke up at night thinking about their lost loved ones, still had nightmares. Richard's death might have ended his life, but it didn't end their suffering. That pain, it stayed with them forever. the interrogations of Richard Ramirez in the months after his arrest painted a clear, chilling picture of a serial killer's mind. The detectives who spoke with him said he was a man without a shred of remorse, a guy who would smile even when recounting his most horrifying crimes. One of the key interrogations happened in October 1985, 2 months after he was caught. Detective Salerno and his partner, Detective Carrillo, sat down with Richard in the interrogation room. This time, they wanted to dig deeper into the details of his crimes. Salerno placed a folder on the table and said, "Richard, we want to talk about the night of March 27th, the night you went to the Zazara's house." Richard stared at the ceiling and replied, "I said I want to see my lawyer." Salerno nodded. "Yeah, I know, but I thought maybe you'd want to talk. Maybe you'd tell us what happened that night." Richard turned his head to look at Salerno, grinning. "And why would you think I want to talk?" Salerno leaned forward. "Because I think you want people to know. You want them to know what you did. You want the fame." Richard locked eyes with him. Silence for a few moments. Then he began to speak. "That night, I just wanted to feel power. I wanted to see what it's like when someone dies. I wanted to see their eyes, how their breathing stops. It's always been something I was curious about." Carrillo asked, "So you enjoyed killing?" Richard looked at him. "Enjoy? No. It went beyond enjoyment. It was a spiritual experience. When you kill someone, you feel like God. You feel you have absolute power. And that feeling is the best thing in the world." Salerno glanced at Carrillo. Both were stunned. They had dealt with plenty of killers before, but none like Richard. None this ruthless, this fearless. Salerno asked, "And why choose older men and women? Why them?" Richard laughed. "Why? Because they were easy. Because they couldn't fight back. Because they got scared first. But sometimes I picked young ones too. Sometimes young couples. I wanted to see how strong their love was. I wanted to see if they'd die for each other or not." Carrillo snapped, "You're insane. You're not even human." Richard stared back. His smile faded. In a cold voice, he said, "I am human, just like you. The difference is, I had the guts to be free. The guts to do what I wanted. But you," he said, "you walked the streets at night, scouting homes, looking for open windows, unlocked doors, houses with the lights off. I knew which houses were vulnerable. I could feel it, like a hunter sensing his prey." He talked about his weapons too. He said he didn't stick to any one weapon. He used whatever he could find: hammers, knives, guns, even his own hands. "I didn't want a pattern. I knew that if I had a pattern, you could find me. So every time, I switched methods, made it harder for you." He spoke about the pentagrams, said they were symbols of the devil's power. "I believe in the devil. He's the only real thing. God's a lie, an illusion. But the devil, he's real. And he gave me power, a allowed me to do things no one else could. Detectives asked if he truly believed in the devil, or if it was just an excuse. Richard's one of the most mysterious moments came when Salerno asked if he had other victims the police didn't know about. Richard paused, then grinned. Maybe there are a few others you'll never find. Maybe I did other things before you identified me. Where? When? Asked Salerno. But Richard just laughed. That's a secret, and I keep my secrets. These words made the police recheck old cases. They looked for unsolved murders that Richard might have committed. They found a few with similarities, but could never definitively tie them to him. To this day, the question remains, did Richard Ramirez have more victims we'll never know about? In one of the last interrogations, Salerno asked, "Why? Why did you do this? Really? Why?" Richard looked at him. For the first time, something shifted in his eyes. Why? Because life is meaningless. Because death's the only real thing. We all die, so what difference does it make who and how? I just decided I'd be the one to decide. I'd be the one with power. And that gave me meaning, made me feel alive. Salerno shook his head. You're sick, Richard. You needed help. But now, it's too late. Richard laughed. I never needed help. I only needed freedom. And now, even in prison, I'm free. Because my mind is free. And no one can take that away. The dialogues between Richard and his interrogators showed a man completely detached from reality, living in his own world, where he was God and everyone else just prey. And that was the world Richard lived in till his last breath. Another notable conversation happened when court psychiatrist Dr. Michael Stone spoke with Richard to assess his mental health. Dr. Stone tried to understand if Richard was truly insane or just a cold, calculated killer. He asked, "When you killed your victims, how did you feel?" Richard answered, "Feel? I felt power, control, felt alive while they died." Dr. Stone asked, "Did you ever think they were human? That they had families, lives?" Richard smiled. "Of course I thought that, but it doesn't change anything. We all die one day. I just decided when their day would be." Dr. Stone shook his head. "You'll have no empathy, no guilt, no remorse." Richard said, "Why should I? I did what I had to do. I fulfilled my destiny." Dr. Stone wrote in his report, "Mr. Ramirez suffers from severe antisocial personality disorder. He is incapable of empathy. He views other humans as objects, not living beings. He feels no guilt or remorse. And he poses a serious threat to society." This report was used in court and helped secure Richard's conviction. But even after his conviction, Richard didn't stop. He began writing his memoirs in prison. Pages and pages about his crimes, his feelings, his beliefs. He wanted to write a book to be published posthumously, a book to tell people who he was and why he did what he did. But no publisher would touch it, saying it was too dark, too violent. In one letter to an old friend, Richard wrote, I know people see me as a monster, but I was just a human with the guts to be free, the guts to do what I wanted. And if that makes me a monster, fine, I'm a monster. But at least I was honest. At least I didn't lie to myself. That letter, like many of Richard's, is preserved in police archives. They stand as a record of a serial killer's mind. A mind that even after years in prison, even facing death, never changed. A mind that until the end believed what he did was right. The moment of Richard Ramirez's execution never came. He spent years on death row, but his body gave out before the judicial system could. In his final days, as cancer devoured him, prison guards noted that he seemed calmer. He was no longer the hyperactive, violent man he once was. Most of the time, he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. Yet even in those last days, when anyone asked if he felt remorse, he still said, "No, I don't regret anything." A week before his death, one of the guards spoke to him. The guard, a man named James, himself a father of 2 daughters, said to Richard, "Richard, you're dying. Do you really want to die with these thoughts? Don't you want to say at least once that you're sorry?" Richard looked at him. His eyes were tired, but the same sinister spark lingered. He said, "Sorry? Sorry for what? For living? For being free? No, I'm not sorry. I'm only sorry I didn't live longer to experience more life." James shook his head. "You're a sick man, Richard. May God have mercy on your soul." Richard chuckled, a weak laugh that turned into a cough. When it ended, he said, God never existed, only the devil, and I'm going to him, and he's waiting for me." James left the room. Later, he told a colleague, "This guy remained the same to the very end. Nothing changed." On Richard's final night, he was alone in the prison infirmary. No visitors came. Doreen had left years ago. His prison friends no longer came. He was truly alone. He lay on the bed, taking short, labored breaths. The pain was intense. He was on strong painkillers, but still suffered. The night guard, a young man named Marcus, checked on him every few minutes. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus heard a sound. Richard was speaking. He went to the cell and asked, "Richard, you with Kay? You need anything?" Richard turned his head and looked at him. In a voice so soft, Marcus had to lean closer to hear. He said, "They're here. They came for me." Marcus looked around. No one was there. He said, "Who's here, Richard? There's no one here." Richard smiled. "My victims. All of them. They're waiting for me." Marcus felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't know if Richard was hallucinating or truly seeing something. Richard continued, "They say it's time. They say I have to come with them. They say hell awaits me." Marcus didn't know what to say. He just stood, staring. Richard closed his eyes. His breaths grew shorter. And at 3:20 a.m., Richard Ramirez took his last breath. Marcus immediately hit the emergency button. Doctors came, but nothing could be done. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, the serial killer who terrorized Los Angeles, was dead. When the news broke, reactions were immediate. Media outlets ran it as top news. People celebrated in the streets. But for the victims' families, it was just a bitter ending. Carol Kyle, the daughter of one of Richard's victims, told reporters upon hearing his death, "I don't know how I feel. On one hand, I'm glad he's dead. But on the other, it doesn't ease my pain. My mother is still gone, and nothing can bring her back." This sentiment was shared by many survivors. They were glad Richard was no longer alive, but their pain remained. Richard's body was buried in a private ceremony. Only a handful attended. His family, who had despised him for years, did not come. Just a priest, 2 prison guards, and 1 childhood friend. The priest said a prayer. "Lord, we do not know what this man did in his life, but we know we are all sinners. We ask you to have mercy on his soul." Then Richard's coffin was lowered into the ground. But Richard's death was not the end of his story. Even after death, he influenced popular culture. Books, films, and countless documentaries were made about him. He became a dark icon. Some saw him as the embodiment of pure evil. Others tried to understand how a human could become such a monster. And unfortunately, some even considered him a hero. In the years that followed, psychologists and criminologists studied the Richard Ramirez case. They tried to understand what turned him into a serial killer. Was it his harsh childhood, head injuries, the influence of his cousin, Miguel, drug addiction, or a combination of all these factors? Dr. Robert Hare, a leading criminal psychiatry expert, wrote in an article, "Richard Ramirez is a classic example of a psychopathic individual. He has no empathy," but others argued this analysis was too simplistic. They said Richard was a product of his environment, and Richard Ramirez was made by a society that failed to protect him as a child. This debate continues to this day. Are serial killers born or made? Do their genes steer them, or does their environment? And can anything be done to prevent the creation of future monsters? These questions remain unanswered. But one thing is certain. Richard Ramirez was one of the worst serial killers in American history. And his story is one that will never be forgotten.